Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Cloud First, Maybe Not, Why a Hybrid Cloud Approach Offers Greater Versatility. And I'm Teresa Resick, the Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And joining me today are Randy Kahn of Kahn Consulting, and from ASG Technologies, we have Greg Wilson and Irene Zlasfeld. And ASG Technologies is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them very much for their support, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. And as we get started here, just want to quickly offer a few tips for participating in today's webinar. By joining our event live, you can resize the different windows in front of you, and then there's a list of icons across the bottom of your screen, and one of those is group chat, and use that to message with each other and also with a few of us here at AIIM. Download the resources that we have available for you, a lot of really cool things in there. And we are taking questions throughout our presentation time today because we are having an open discussion here. And so feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A feature as soon as you think of them. We'll do our best to get to them as we go through each talking point that we're going to have today. And we're still also hoping to have a few minutes at the very end to take any other remaining questions as well. Also would greatly appreciate it when we're all done today to please take a survey. I greatly value that feedback that you provide. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. And now to introduce our lineup of speakers that we have today. And Randolph Kahn Esquire is president of Kahn Consulting. And the consulting team has provided consulting services to major global organizations, including advising U.S. and foreign governments, court systems, and major multinational corporations on a wide variety of information management issues. And Mr. Kahn has been an expert witness in major court cases and is a trusted advisor and consultant to corporations and governmental agencies. He is a highly sought-after speaker and author, and Randy teaches Law and Policy of Electronic Information at Washington University's School of Law, and also the Politics of Information at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we also have with us Greg Wilson, who leads ASG Technologies' Product Specialist Team for North America's Content Services Division. And Greg's career in content spans 20 years, including tenures with leading technology firms in the content industry, as well as startups. And then we also have with us Irene Zlasfeld, and he leads ASG Technologies' Solution Engineering Team. And Irene is recognized for his ability to effectively present complex technical and business solutions to a variety of audiences, including highly technical teams and C-level executives. And he's skilled at aligning IT priorities and business objectives to facilitate increased efficiency and reduce costs and deliver quality technology and process improvement solutions to his clients. And so as we get started here, and one of the things that we were all discussing just before we came on live with you today is the importance of needing to set the baseline of what we're talking about when it comes to hybrid cloud. And so before I turn things over to Greg Wilson, and I'm going to start with him, just Greg, for you just to set that baseline definition of hybrid cloud, just so that we can take the discussion from there. Greg?
Yeah, that sounds great, Teresa. Thanks so much. So I think for the sake of our discussion here today in hybrid cloud, and certainly looking at it from a content management lens, I think a good definition for us to start from here is if we think of hybrid cloud as a mix of services or applications that are deployed on premises as well as in the cloud, with orchestration between those two environments. So this could be an application that's deployed on premises, but leveraging the cloud for storing the archives or content from that application. This could also be two or more instances of an application, one being on-prem, the other one being in the cloud, that share workloads or documents and archives. So the real idea with hybrid cloud here is from on-premise and cloud deployments really coming together and intermingling so that companies can match and move content and workloads to the right environments at the right times, depending on their business, their governance, and their technology needs. And with that, let's go ahead and, thanks, Teresa. So with that, let's go ahead and dig into some of our discussion topics for today. As Randy and Irene and I had a chance to get together and roundtable kind of where we see the market around content management and cloud going. There were a number of questions that continued to arise, and we thought this would be a really good format for our time together here today. So with that, I'll start us off on one that I think just comes up over and over again as we're out chatting with clients was, why does it make economic sense to put content in the cloud in the first place? And Randy, if you'd like to take a first crack at this, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Sure, thanks. Hello, everybody. One of the things that sort of struck me about the marketplace the last few years, we've gone from, a very small number of folks and businesses comfortable in moving their information to the cloud to a really substantial business today. So, for example, Gartner predicts that this year, I believe, the growth of just public clouds themselves is going to be somewhere between 17 and 18%. And that's going to be north of $200 billion in revenue, and that's just public cloud. And that indicates to me that something's happening that I think is worth noting, which basically is there's a product, and that product must be valuable, which is why people are in herds taking their content, their important business content, and parking it in the cloud. And I think that the reason for that is a couple things, right? One is I have infinite scalability. If I have to run my IT operations and storage, which grows for some businesses 50% a year, so I'm doubling my information footprint every year or two, that means I have to constantly be ready to grow and constantly be ready to scale. Well, if I could offload that problem to somebody else who can buy storage cheaper and can do it equally as secure, wouldn't it make great sense to start to park our data in the cloud? And I think that when the herd marches there and they're parking significant business content, and when you see these kinds of numbers, I think there's a real economic reason, right? In the end, if it didn't make economic sense, people wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, Randy, really good point. Urain, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, Greg, as you kind of implied, it really depends on your goals about, does it make sense to put things into the cloud? Does it revolve around cost? Cost meaning the infrastructure, cost meaning support of that infrastructure. Something the things that describe what you do of the cloud. Sometimes it's a matter of, you need global distribution, or you have slow legacy systems, or you have problems with document sharing. So depending on the goals, certainly it can make a lot of sense too, and certainly as Randy suggested, there's a lot of people marching toward that for probably those very reasons.
Yeah, I would say as well, I think, based off of studies that I've read and also what we've seen with our clients, and I think this really holds true, is that most enterprises, their hardware utilization is probably below 20% of what they're utilizing on a day-to-day basis of kind of handling just overall demand. And the reason for that is they're very concerned with what happens during those peak seasons and peak times, right? It could be end of month, end of quarter, end of year, and the stress on those systems internally. It could also be the seasonality of the business that they're in, whether that's tax season or, retailers and what's happening around the holiday season. So I think part of it is there's that natural line that you kind of look at how big these systems are to handle that peak and how much they sent dormant. I also would say, too, that on the economic cost, and I think this goes to where you're going, Urain, I think the goals from my perspective have also really shifted in the last couple of years as we chat with clients about cloud. And I think there is that push of economic sense and cost savings, but I think more and more we're also seeing that on top of just lowering the IT cost, it's the agility it brings to the organization and what they're doing to try to take market share and compete, with what they're rolling out as far as solutions go to their clients, to their vendors, and to their partners. And if you think about the ideas and projects that get started in an organization, only to be stalled or placed on lower priority because it takes 3 to 6 months for them to get all of the hardware in place before the project takes off. By the time that they got all of the hardware and infrastructure in place, a lot of times other initiatives have then taken priority, and those are set back on the shelf again without ever really being explored. So I think a lot of what I'm seeing is certainly that drive on the cost effectiveness, but certainly that agility and things moving forward there as well, which is interesting to see that shift and see organizations pick that up as they can quickly roll out new applications, put up test environments, and on day one start the development effort around these new applications and solutions.
Yeah, if I can just jump in real quickly before we move on.
Yes.
The allocation point you made I think is actually true. We had a client engagement where we were helping a European bank clean up their CRUD. And one of the things that we realized when we were going through the various systems is that they overbought storage because they didn't know what their future need was. So in addition to sort of, to your point, not using all that they had unallocated storage, which was substantial expense that never got touched. And so I think, again, for organizations like that, especially big global organizations or big companies, it makes a great deal of sense to have that infinite scalability, have that lower cost of storage. But more than that even, you don't have to plan for the future in the same way that you could do if you're buying hardware and software to deal with that. And I just think, all in all, I think the business case is fairly compelling.
Yeah, really good point. For us at ASG and with Mobius Technology, I mean, we see many of our banking financial services customers in the Fortune 1000 that the IT teams are biting their nails as they get into tax season of kind of rolling the dice and guessing those patterns of how people are going to want to log into those systems and pull down their tax information. And we've really been working on these types of solutions with cloud because that auto scaling just takes not just the cost away, but all of that guessing and all the concern of that customer experience as they go on and downloading their investor information. So really good points on that slide. I appreciate that, guys. Let's hop along to the next slide here. So another discussion point we have is, should there be any concerns with governance security in the cloud for your enterprise content? And Randy, once again, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. So, my view about clouds, and I suppose it's not a surprising view, is that, like all technology, not all clouds are created equal. I think not all vendors are created equal, and I think that folks, when looking in the marketplace as to who to partner with and what vendors to work with, I think they need to focus on functionality, focus on the services that are provided and the cost, because I do think that, again, different providers provide different functionality and different value, and so from that perspective, there should be some significant tire kicking. But more than that, I think also is there are clouds that provide simply sort of a big parking lot. I'm going to dump my stuff there, and it's the storage that's being provided is probably least functionality, least cost, least security. And I think that, again, buyer beware. If I'm a big regulated business, the idea of parking my stuff anywhere is bad business. The idea of parking my stuff in a cloud that doesn't have sufficient governance or sufficient security, again, bad business. So, again, not all clouds are not created equal, and I think that it behooves the purchasers clearly to kick the tire. So that was one point. The other point that I was going to make about this, so we had a client that had it's a medical device manufacturer, and they had IT drive and I'm not going to mention the name, but they bought a public cloud, spent $3 million. They were, knee-deep months into the implementation, and the lawyers and compliance people and the privacy people came in and said, hey, wait, this is insufficient for our needs, and they had to stop it. It was, a big expense, a big inconvenience. At the same time that we've gotten people hooked, at least portion of the organization, hooked on using the technology. So I really do think not only that you need to do the sort of diligence, but you need to do it upfront and really determine not only business needs, not only technical requirements, but also legal and compliance needs as well, and that should be done upfront.
Yeah, good stuff. It makes me think about, Randy, from our side, we support, we're certified with our content services platform on AWS and Azure, and many of our clients point in that direction, but we also have many clients as well that are looking at other public cloud providers and rolled out on those, are also deployed on private cloud. And part of it from our side is being able to offer that flexibility to kind of help them through that process, I think, on lessons learned around that, and realizing that you're still going to have the security that you need to handle within those particular applications. But one thing that you're certainly going to get with somebody like an Amazon or an Azure or a Google is all of that investment dollar of protecting the overall security management within that platform. So an organization, if it's a managed service and they've outsourced that application security around it, that's fine. But that lower level with that security management is going to make sense. And if we look at somebody like AWS, where 55% of the company's operating profits, back last year and second quarter came from AWS for all of Amazon. So obviously it's a huge driver for them, a huge driver on profitability and revenue, and something that they'll continue to put that money into to move that along and keep the security top notch. Ray, anything from your perspective on this?
Yeah, kind of reflective of both of what you've been talking about is really it's a shared security model, right? So when you go into these cloud deployments, something like an AWS or any other cloud provider, they're responsible for the security of all those cloud type infrastructures, the compute, the storage, the database service, perhaps the networking. They'll provide a global infrastructure that's secure for regions and availability zones and the like, but it's still up to the customer to be responsible for the security that's inside that cloud, right? So that certainly includes the customer data. As Randy was saying, you can't just throw it out there and expect it to just be okay. You're still responsible for that. As far as identity and access management, that becomes a critical component when you move into the cloud. So you'll spend a bit of time dealing with the AIIM rules and so forth so that people have the proper credentials, they have the right rights, and so on. So it really becomes kind of that shared security model between the cloud provider and the customer. It's not just the AWS or Azure or anybody else isn't responsible for everything. The customer remains responsible for that customer data, where it sits, on what it sits, and so on.
Yeah, it makes good sense, Sherry, and I appreciate that in taking the points that Randy and I made kind of a little bit further along. Let's hop along to our third point here, which is consolidation of legacy systems and migration to the cloud can be challenging. How do we make it easier and less expensive? And this is certainly one of those items that come up over and over again that we see with clients, and Randy, as we've chatted, I know with you as well. So if you'd like to start us up on this conversation, Randy, and then we'll open it up.
Sure. Yeah, so we deal with clients at Con Consulting fairly often that are moving to new systems, migrating, and so there's a couple things I wanted to talk about. Obviously, having a plan, the idea of taking on everything at once for most organizations is untenable. And I think that when looking at the body of information, when you're talking about terabytes or petabytes of data, and many of our clients have, dozens of petabytes of data, it's overwhelming, right? So I think having a plan that lays out what you're doing, who's doing it, when you're doing it, structured, unstructured, which systems. I think, again, I wouldn't minimize the idea of having a plan also in terms of not only an IT sort of optic into a plan, but also the business units who are going to be in some way impacted by that migration or change, right? So I think that plan is a big deal. I think that communication and training, trying to tell folks what's coming and how it's going to affect their world, where their stuff is going to be parked, how they're going to have access to it, makes sense, right? So giving people an expectation of what's going to happen if there's going to be a change that impacts them, what that's going to look like, where they're going to have to go, or there's not going to be a change, we're just going to have a minor interruption. I just think managing expectations is a really big deal as well, and that goes through communication and training. But more than that even, the issue of expense and the issue of sort of ease of change or migration, there's a couple of things that come up. We have a client that had a migration issue, amongst other things, and some systems that were going offline. And one of the things that became clear is that the IT folks didn't really have a great handle on stuff that existed out there, including whole systems that didn't really need to be babysat anymore. So, when you're looking at migration or you're looking at sort of dealing with legacy content, I do think it's a great time as you make a change to look around the environment to determine maybe it's whole systems, right, that can go away because the stuff is no longer needed, and whether there's a business or a legal basis upon which to make that stuff go away, it's a really good time to look. So I think, again, plan, communication, training, and taking stuff off the table that makes the world a lot more complex, makes the volume that much greater, and makes the migration that much more of a pain in the butt. Those are the starting points.
All very valid starting points. Thank you very much for that. Urain, how about from your side?
Yeah, I do think it's important to at least make a distinction on, migrating the cloud. Am I migrating, the current content services platform from an on-prem version to a cloud version? That's a very different kind of a process than addressing the bigger issues that Randy was certainly referring to of, how do I consolidate and or federate what I currently have out there from those other legacy systems? It makes all the sense in the world, certainly, to understand what those systems are and what they have in it so that you can, provide the most effective migration path for that, both for cost savings, certainly, and for any governance requirements that get applied at that point in time. Certainly federation is there to be able to support that transitionary time as well, right? So as you go through that understanding of the data and as things get more cloud-based, you can continue to support the legacy systems with a federated platform. And certainly that eases the transition, but certainly the understanding of what you have and how best to move that along, takes time. It's certainly potentially a complex thing to deal with.
Yeah, it reminded me too. I guess from our side, what we see a lot of, and I think back to one of the leading property and casualty insurers that we've worked with around this, and we've got some collateral included here around Liberty Mutual and the project that we took on there, but being able to offer that type of flexibility, and Randy, you brought up a point about business users and reducing impact and setting expectations. What we saw at Liberty Mutual is rolling out a federation piece first, which was a nice win for the business, of end users that had to go into 5 or 10 or more disparate systems, all through different logins, all through different search capabilities and retrieval, and giving a single unified view across that. So the business out of the gates gets a quick win. The users are happy. And then the architects and the IT team start going through that migration process behind the scenes that is not really impacting that business community at that point is pretty key. I also see that these projects can kind of take on a life of their own, and having flexibility as we start meeting with and talking to key stakeholders across an organization where certain departments that might be related to invoices or customer onboarding have certain service level agreements that they want to make sure that they can control and keep things on-prem for a while in kind of their own fiefdom, if you will. But then they're much more comfortable, 30 days, 90 days out of that information being migrated out to the cloud and handled differently. So I think that kind of hybrid environment that offers that flexibility of being able to pass archives and move information from on-prem to cloud and then from cloud provider to cloud provider really starts to open that up. Another project that comes to mind was a client we worked with that was moving initially a lot of a mainframe shutdown project, migrating from the mainframe to open systems and then looking at moving to cloud, initially starting with private cloud. And once they started to see the costs and really the realization of what that ongoing fee was going to be, they ran numbers and realized that it would be better for them to move to a public cloud like Google or Amazon. And now we're in the process of that process and project with them, but realizing that with the instances of what they have in place from a content services platform, there's that flexibility of moving those archives around without reprocessing, which gives them great flexibility of what they're doing between these multi-cloud and hybrid cloud types of environments. So the next discussion point we have up here is, should I clean up my content and unstructured data before we begin consolidating or migrating to the cloud? So it's an excellent question. Randy, I'll pass this one over to you.
Yeah, so I have a fairly strong view on this topic. I am not a huge fan of moving households and taking all the crud in my garage and my basement that we haven't touched in decades and moving it over to the new house. And I think the same applies in the context of moving your information, right? If you haven't used it and you don't need it and it has no legal or business value, why haul it on over? Making a migration to the cloud is a great time to have sort of a new, clean look at your information. And from my perspective, taking the time to, in a legally defensible kind of way, purge the unstructured and structured content from your coffers, from your information coffers, makes total sense. In that regard, I would tell you we've spent a lot of time helping organizations sort of deal with that migration and deal with the policies to clean up the crud. I think that most organizations, again, don't really fully appreciate the complexity of that problem. Attacking unstructured stuff is completely different than attacking structured stuff. Trying to have a legal basis upon which you can make huge cuts of chunks of your information as opposed to one by one or onesies is, again, a really complex exercise. Again, complex, but nonetheless essential. So, I think from my perspective, don't move all your crud to a clean environment and clutter it. It's expense and inconvenience and more chaos that you had before bringing over to this new environment. Clean it up, attack it, do it in a legally defensible way, document it, and move on and live in this brand new, shiny White House and move forward.
That sounds good. I appreciate that feedback and putting that effort in up front around some of these items. Urain, how about from your perspective as we look at that idea of the steps to take prior to consolidating and migrating?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the ideal is certainly to bring over clean data and only clean data. There are some exceptions to that we do find, and we've had customers that say run on a mainframe and find that storage cost was potentially exceptionally high, and just moving that to say S3 out on Amazon gave them an immediate cost benefit. And that was kind of an invisible thing to their users. They still continue to use the mainframe facilities. They still just have access. The only thing that changed was the storage upon which that stuff resided. Now, certainly that would have to be, compatible with any kind of, sensitive data or, governance issues that might come up with some of that data. And ideally down the road, it would get cleaned up. But there are certainly circumstances where you can justify just bringing it over onto realizing some cost savings, but don't ignore it after that. I mean, certainly go back and clean it up so it's kind of like that storage unit you might have got along with your house move. You don't want to leave it there forever necessarily without going through it and cleaning it up. So certainly that's the thing to do. So it kind of comes down to all those same things, right? There may be a cost advantage initially to just bring it over, but at some point you do need to kind of identify what you have, either from a cost perspective for storage. A lot of these systems that we deal with generate huge amounts of information. They're coming from applications. Freeing up storage certainly makes a lot of sense, no matter where it is. And of course, identifying any sensitive information that might need some additional handling relative to any kind of PI information and so on. And of course, there's that usual thing of just at least making a determination of how old is that content. Some of that may be able to be aged off before bothering to do any kind of replatforming of the storage.
Yeah, thanks, Urain. Yeah, I think from my side, and you touched upon this as well, I think it's that idea of the two things it boils down to on cleaning up that content and unstructured data is cost and governance, right? And I think we're very pragmatic about this of, what are those storage costs that you'd be dealing with, if you're keeping it on-prem or you're moving it out to cloud? What's the cost and time and effort of identifying the documents and deciding if they can be removed? And then also that cost of retrieving, documents if they're accessed. A lot of times it might seem like a great idea of, we've got a lot of content and documents that haven't been accessed in 10 years. If we're migrating to, let's say, AWS, let's put them out in Glacier. It's very cheap storage. But what you also see is if the information that's being put out on Glacier that hasn't been accessed in 10 years is customer information or employee information, it can get rather expensive with Glacier if something like a class action lawsuit happens and all those documents need to be retrieved in a short period of time. So I think one thing that we try to do is, take a look at these systems. Sometimes with legacy systems, you can have limited metadata of maybe only one or two fields that really identify what we're looking at. But trying to understand from a governance perspective, if it's customer documentation, if it's employee records, if it's tied into other documents and records that would need governance around that, and then taking the proper steps. I think with the tools that we have available through data intelligence and what we do at ASG, we can also look at those retrieval patterns of that content, understand the metadata and if it's being leveraged upstream or downstream to understand those flows as well, and really get more of a concise picture around data lineage as well as impact analysis before some of these systems start to be moved and migrated, which certainly just help to diminish those surprises as we go along through the process. So next question, another one that digs into security in a little bit of a different way here. So regarding security, if I'm going to put serious stuff in the cloud, why is AWS or Azure better than on-premises? And once again, I think a great question, and one that I think really starts out at that starting block of trying to understand from a security perspective how we differentiate. So, Randy, I'll pass this over to you for first comment.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that if you go back historically, a few years, maybe even a decade, lots of organizations had trepidatious feelings to move their stuff to the cloud. I want to have it. I want to see it. I want to kick it. I want to secure it. My people are better. We can do it better than those guys. And what I've come to believe, and by the way, I was one of those guys probably a decade ago, right? It's nice to have your stuff, nice to be able to say that it's inside this computer, inside these walls, inside, and you can speak to that in terms of the hybrid versus not. But as it relates to the security piece, I've come to conclude, number one, if somebody wants something bad enough, they're going to get it no matter where it is. And then number two, when the Department of Defense or the FBI moves their stuff to the cloud, I have to think that they believe, right, that the cloud is at least as secure as anything that I can build. So what I've really come to conclude over time is, and by the way, if you have the AWSs of the world and the Azures of the world, they're using monumentally significant resources to build the best security, to ensure that it's not only your stuff, but everybody else's stuff that's parked there is properly secured. So, a few things, right? They have better resources than most companies do. They understand that if somebody breaches the environment once, their entire business model is challenged. So they have incredibly compelling reasons to get security right. And I just think they can do it as good as anybody, and certainly better than most companies. So once upon a time, I didn't believe that, but today I believe that good cloud providers can provide way better security than most in-house folks.
Agreed. I think the investment and the resources that those organizations are able and willing to put into the security that you're finding out in these cloud platforms makes good sense. Urain, how about from your perspective?
I certainly have to agree with that, and to some degree, when you think of kind of that, shared security model, I mean, you basically have the same security task as a user of those cloud services that you need to do no matter where your servers are located, whether they're cloud or on-prem, right? So certainly you do spend a little bit of time, dealing with the account credentials, setting up user accounts, making sure the identity and access management is conforms with, corporate guidelines and so on. Do you use multi-factor authentication, not require SSL, and so on. So those are all things that are provided for with the cloud providers, but you do need to spend a little bit of time to make sure that, those are adequately administered, if you will. We see that. We have a lot of financial customers, and we go in and we actually have to spend a fair amount of time sometimes making sure we have proper access, with certain things are blacklisted or whitelisted and so on. So there are certainly security best practices, but it does involve, having to make sure that you administer them appropriately. And that's true whether it was on-prem or in the cloud. The cloud certainly provides you a standard set of services that you can implement that type of activity.
Yeah, you're right, and that's a really good point as well. It's funny, as we were chatting about this one previously in our roundtable too, part of it from my perspective is it's moving this to the cloud also kind of forces many organizations from an application perspective to get up to those current versions. And it can be very challenging with organizations that have very complex and vast infrastructures of just keeping up with the versions of what's out there and the latest patches and fixes at an application level rather than thinking about this from the platform and environment level. And I think that push and move to the cloud is also a good step in that direction to make that happen as well, which is, I guess, a bit of an extension from the conversation here thus far. So, yeah, good feedback on this one. I really appreciate it. Good conversation around these different topics. So, Urain, certainly thank you for feedback and your thoughts on this, and Randy as well. The next thing that we had down here is just a slide to talk a little bit about things to consider as we're talking about cloud first versus hybrid and moving to cloud and those types of things. So I think what's really important, and we certainly touched upon this here today in our conversation, is upfront analysis and planning is key. And in a few different ways, right? So I think being able to take a look at those systems that you have running on premises today and have some prioritization around those systems of which ones should be consolidated or flagged to be migrated to the cloud. And these can be based off of a couple of different things. It can be company directives. If company directives are around cost cutting or customer service or new market share, around innovative solutions, it makes really good sense to, as we start prioritizing